The marriage certificate is still preserved in the state archives, brittle as the promise it pretends to keep. It names Jeremiah Aldridge as husband and Celeste as nothing more than an entry beneath his signature, listed as property instead of person. What follows that paper is uglier than ink, can show a string of deaths and a social horror that the county pretended not to notice. In March of 1854, a ceremony took place that shocked neighbors, but it was the months afterward that revealed the true cruelty hidden behind polite society. Local press of the time, guarded by wealthy families, buried hints beneath elegant columns, while private diaries wrote in a language of panic and shame. The union was not born of affection, not of law, and not of any consent that matters. It was a spectacle contrived as punishment and proof. Tonight, I will guide you through how a wager and a manipulated marital bond became a weapon of humiliation in a place whose whole power depended on appearances. The people who arranged this thing used law like a mask and ritual like a blade. They believed that public ritual could rewrite private harm, and that a certificate might bind shame into a document respectable men would carry like a shield. But paper remembers what polite mouths refuse to speak. The archive keeps its brittle testimony, even when graves are covered and whispers are paid to die. We will walk the river road to Willowbrook and read what the ledger will not tell plainly. We will meet the men who thought themselves architects of destiny, and the women and servants whose lives became the raw materials for their games. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Type "The veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Before we walk the river road toward Willowbrook, make sure you subscribe and tell us where you're listening from. Your place in the map makes this story sharper. Listen closely. Let the first image sink in: a bride in borrowed linen whose name is written as property, a signature that reads like an order, and a town that will do almost anything to keep its secrets. This is a story about how appearances were engineered to protect crimes, and how a single certificate would become a hinge for ruin. Jeremiah had not been born into privilege. He arrived in New Orleans with little more than a satchel of illusions and a willingness to do what others would not. He partnered with men who found opportunity in the gray spaces where law blurred with profit, and together they carved a business out of those shadows. The Delta trading enterprise began as a warehouse operation and matured into a monstrous machine, fronts and ledgers that hid human cargo as easily as crates of sugar. Aldridge learned early that money could buy silence, and that silence could be purchased from the same people whose mouths were easiest to bribe. He invested his early spoils into Willowbrook, a plantation that sang of new status and old lies. Its columns stood like a public claim against history, a ledger of success purchased with other people's suffering. He cultivated respectability with forged deeds and dinner invitations, but his hands remained stained with the trade that built his fortune. While reputable gentlemen spoke of sugar and soil, men like him trafficked in roots from forbidden islands and in the silence of corrupt clerks. He understood that legitimacy is often a performance, and that a convincing script can cover a murder as easily as a family portrait covers an empty coffin. The plantation itself became a stage where appearances were rehearsed, and where servants learned to speak only when spoken to, and to look only when permitted. In rooms filled with oil paintings, he practiced the posture of a gentleman and employed the vocabulary of magnanimity, confident that his investments would buy him a seat at any table. But carelessness grows like mold in cellars, and sooner or later someone begins to pry at the boards. The men who had been his partners were useful until they were dangerous. The small lies that had stitched their enterprise together could be pulled apart with patient fingers. The history that made Aldridge a man of property also exposed the ledger that might make him a man of crime, and the tension between those two facts would determine what happened next. When federal marshals began to ask inconvenient questions about manifests and rotes, the business that had prospered in darkness felt a sudden chill. The partners convened in the old warehouse, a place built of crates and quiet deals, and there the thin veneer of brotherhood cracked. Aldridge arrived with a pistol hidden in his coat and a boot that kept the shape of a blade, and he had already chosen his story. A tragic dispute turned deadly, with him as the lone surviving, grieving partner. The violence that evening was swift and messy. A single shot rang like thunder, a table overturned in desperation, and a man lay dying with a look of betrayal fixed on his face. Aldridge staged the scene with a careful cruelty. He planted money, left a bloody knife in a convenient hand, and arranged witnesses whose testimony had been purchased by coins and promises. He perfected a version of events that fit the appetite of a police force eager to close a case that involved respectable names. The official report read like tidy fiction, and within days the warehouse itself was demolished, erasing the place that had been the enterprise's heart. With his partners silenced, Aldridge moved quickly to claim the spoils. Bank vaults opened, properties transferred, and debts conveniently forgiven. He presented himself as the bereaved survivor of a terrible dispute and used forged documents to weave a narrative that allowed banks and neighbors to trust him. The economy of the region swallowed his performance. The respectable believed the respectable story because it served their convenience. But what he did not anticipate were the families left behind. Those who had lost brothers and fathers began to look beyond the tidy police report for inconsistencies, and the persistence of grief turned into a slow, dangerous curiosity. They kept records, asked awkward questions in quiet rooms, and noticed details that had been arranged for effect. Patience, once merely a virtue, became the engine of a revenge that would not be satisfied with a hastily closed case. Philip Devo and Henry Rochelle were men shaped by loss and then sharpened by a strategic mind. They did not rush towards spectacle or noisy vengeance. They cultivated a patient intelligence that would undermine Aldridge with the precision of a slow, acting toxin. They studied his habits, the edges of his pride, and the places where social reputation is most vulnerable. Rather than confront him with crude violence, they chose a subtler cruelty to erode the very foundations of his authority until the man who had built himself from stolen silence would be forced to confess the hollowness beneath his name. They observed gambling halls where Aldridge bled money and the banking rooms where his credit could be nudged like a chess piece. Through careful bribery, well-placed whispers, and the quiet pressure of legal maneuvers, they began to shape his ruin. The choice to use Celeste was not random. It was a study of how humiliation functions in a society obsessed with honor. Celeste, a woman both large in body and formidable in mind, held a quiet dignity that made her the perfect instrument to expose Aldridge's hypocrisy. To place a respected planter in a position where he would appear to have married one of his own servants would tear at the fragile fabric of his social image, revealing the rot beneath. Philip and Henry believed that public shame, orchestrated with care, could do what bullets could not. It could make a man feel his status erode slowly, in full view of the very people whose respect he had purchased. They planned the ceremony like a play, but they also planned the aftermath with equal ruthlessness, understanding that humiliation can be a long, patient work. The marriage would not merely be a symbol, it would be a legal instrument and a social weapon. Type, the veil is broken twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Type, the veil is broken twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. They knew how to manipulate the legal forms, and they knew how to press the right buttons in polite society until a man who thought he had bought honor would discover he had been sold a lie. Celeste moved through Willowbrook's kitchens with a steadiness that made her presence feel inevitable, as if the house itself trusted the rhythm of her hands. Her work was not just the mixing of spices and the tending of pots, it was the quiet administration of life under the plantation's roof. She knew who ate early, who needed medicines, and the exact place where a child's fever first showed itself. But beyond those practicalities, her memory held ledger like clarity, names, debts, offenses, kindnesses catalogued with an accuracy that frightened the men who underestimated her. To the planter class she was invisible until they required a meal. To the house and the field she was indispensable, a quiet authority who could marshal resources and soothe tempers. Compared to the public spectacle Aldridge cultivated, Celeste's sovereignty was interior and practical. She kept house not because she loved the planter who had claimed her, but because survival demands clever accounting on the small trades of mercy. Philip and Henry recognized more than her bodily presence when they observed her. They saw how she moved, how she watched, how she remembered. She had learned long ago that knowledge is itself a kind of currency, and that the people who hold memory can become, in time, the keepers of opportunity. The conspirators did not wish to harm her. They wished to use the spectacle of marriage to overturn the planters' standing, and they believed that Celeste's intelligence could be contained within their plan. But intelligence has its own will, and where the conspirators imagined a passive instrument, Celeste carried a private world of choices that would make their neat designs more complicated. She had friends in the house and in the fields, women and men who trusted her counsel, and those relationships would matter when the social storm came. She had endured much, and endurance taught her methods of subtle resistance that could protect others when the time required it. In the space between oven and table, she kept watch and counted the cost of a pageant she had not wanted. The wager was born in rooms that smelled of smoke and cheap whiskey, where men measured courage by the thickness of their purses. Aldridge, whose appetite for risk had fed his ascent, boasted that no spectacle could break him. A cruel challenge followed: he'll take one of his own enslaved people as a wife for a year, prove ownership and control publicly, and the man who held the title would win the bet. They dressed the idea in laughter, but laughter is often the veneer for cruelty. To the conspirators, the mock marriage was the perfect trap, a ritual designed to humiliate a man whose reputation was his most fragile asset. They staged the ceremony in Willowbrook's parlor with just enough decorum to turn the grotesque into an event. The affidavit was written with hands that had practiced forgery before, and clerks who owed favors filed the necessary papers with hands that trembled but complied. The image they crafted was shocking precisely because it used a sacred form, marriage, and stripped it of consent. A bride in linen stood while smiling faces insisted on propriety, and Celeste found herself placed at the center of a social experiment she had not agreed to. Some neighbors tried to look away, others treated the event as theater and applauded the planters' boldness. But in the weeks and months after, the performance reverberated in ways the conspirators had predicted and in ways they had not. The legal paper survived, brittle and precise, and it would later be read like evidence not of love but of degradation. The ceremony turned Celeste into a symbol in the town's mouth, and symbols have ways of outliving those who initially fashioned them. For Celeste, the day was a fracture in the life she had known, a visible line drawn between what was required and what she secretly refused to be. Theatrics had become strategy, and Willowbrook's social landscape shifted under that strain. Men who had once envied Aldridge now considered in private ways what it would mean to side against him. The months after the staged marriage were not quiet. They were an unspooling of small calamities that seemed unrelated until patterns emerged. Guests took ill with odd fevers, horses stumbled on familiar roads, creditors collapsed from sudden ailments, and the parish gossip recorded what it could not openly name. Private letters spoke in cipher about suspicious meals and late-night visitors at Willowbrook. And the most polite families began to observe a new caution when the planter moved through society. Investigations that should have followed these strange events stumbled because the institutions of justice and propriety were entangled with the same networks that protected the conspirators. A local doctor would ascribe a death to consumption, a magistrate would prefer plausible deniability, and a banker would shrug and call it misfortune when a note came due. Yet where law failed, rumor flourished, and rumor is a tool when wielded correctly. Philip and Henry watched from the edges, measuring the town's patience and recording which alliances broke and which remained stubbornly loyal. Each passing misfortune tightened the public noose around Aldridge's reputation, but it also risked collateral harm. The conspirators were careful. They wanted ruin that looked like misfortune rather than murder, because a society that fears scandal will often favor expedience over examination. Meanwhile, Celeste continued to keep the house while the world outside reshaped itself around whispered suspicions. She navigated 1,000 small dangers with quiet skill: a sick child here, a tearful woman there, a neighbor whose temper toasted like iron. Her role in the household kept her exposed, but it also gave her opportunities to shield those she could. As the conspiracy unfolded and small tragedies mounted, the town's appetite for entertainment began to turn into hunger for accountability, and that hunger would soon demand something more resolute than gossip. Aldridge's confidence collapsed into a raw, fearful question: who among me has turned against me? His nights shortened, his face grew gaunt, and the bravado that had been his armor thinned under insomnia and suspicion. He spent hours along the riverbank in the dark, looking for answers in the water's indifferent flow, as though the river held counsel a man could buy. His hands, once steady with the weight of deeds and signatures, began to tremble at small tasks. He misread accounts, missed payments, and lashed out at those who had been loyal. His cruelty shifted into erratic displays meant to frighten and restore order. But terror soon breeds only resentment, and resentment spreads in ways power cannot command. Invitations cooled. Men who had once toasted him preferred distance and soft words. The planter who had once stood tall now retreated into unsteady solitude. As his economy tightened, gamblers began to close their doors to him or to arrange stakes he could not win. The slow collapse of his social capital felt like drowning, because a man's identity in that world was measured by the company he kept and the respect he could command. When confronted in public, he tried to reassert the story of being a wronged and unlucky man, but his manners now rang false. He attempted legal remedies, but the courts, wary of entanglement with scandal, provided little succor. The town, sensing a spectacle, watched to see whether he would break, or whether he would do something desperate enough to make the crisis final. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. The falling man is often more dangerous than the triumphant one, because he will clutch at anything to stop the descent, and those around him learn how fragile the claim to dominance truly was. Henry and Philip moved in tandem, not with the clamor of men swinging swords, but with the quiet efficacy of those who understand the law's seams. Henry, who had walked clerk rooms and built relationships with bank tellers and managers, began nudging documents, slowing approvals, and arranging for interest rates to become unkind to a man overloaded with credit. Philip cultivated the gambling dens, placing Aldridge in games where the odds were stacked against him, and where friendly players made sure a loss would not be merely financial but humiliating. They coordinated with distant clerks and dock workers who owed favors, and bit by bit they altered the financial landscape under Aldridge's feet. Mortgages were called in at the worst possible times, payment schedules were rearranged to coincide with lean seasons, creditors who had once been deferential now sent letters that read like commands. It was not spectacular violence, but it was surgical, and it had the effect of making a man who once bought his way through trouble feel naked and exposed. Aldridge signed documents in lamplight that he did not fully read, agreements that would later be cited in rooms where men gathered to discuss his ruin, as if it were an inevitability. He begged for extensions and favors, but each concession further eroded his standing. The conspirators made sure that humiliation would follow financial depletion. They wanted him to understand how the same social rituals he had used to command others could be used to unmake him. As his debts mounted, so did his desperation, and desperation opens doors to mistakes that are, in the end, irreversible. While ledgers and bets shaped the public currents, Celeste worked in the private tides of the household where choices were made beneath notice. She kept confidences, tended to children, and brokered small mercies that sustained whole families. Those quiet acts built networks of loyalty that were not written in any ledger, but that mattered in times of danger. Women in the servant quarters began to trust her counsel, men who worked the fields brought her news and small offerings, and children who once feared her grew to depend on a steady voice. She used each relationship to protect what she could: a name here, a ration there, a place to hide when the nights felt unsafe. Her intelligence became the real capital of the house, and she spent it carefully. Celeste did not see herself primarily as an instrument of revenge. She saw herself as a steward of survival, and her practices reflected that choice. She negotiated small reprieves with those who might have been cruel, mollified tempers before threats turned violent, and took risks when the payoff was a life spared. The conspirators had envisaged a passive figure at the center of their plan, but a person with memory and agency is never that simple. Celeste's interventions kept the household intact through months of strain and created pockets of safety where gossip and danger could be mitigated. In the meantime, the town's social terrain shifted, and the more the public watched, the more private acts, hidden and humane, mattered in ways the men with ledgers had not counted. It was in these unobserved choices that the story's moral complexity resided: survival, compromise, protection, and the hard calculus of who to trust. The instrument of humiliation became the lever by which society pried Aldridge open and examined his hollow places. Anonymous letters began to appear in the post, tipped with specifics that a trained eye recognized as more than rumor. Women at garden parties exchanged curt glances and slowly withdrew their acceptances of his invitations. The very society that once banked his smile now kept its distance, and distance is a punishment that cuts in ways money cannot heal. Aldridge attempted to reclaim narrative control through lawsuits and public statements, but courts were reluctant to wade into scandals that implicated many influential families. The legal system preferred stable records and closed files over messy inquiries that might reveal deeper complicities. Men who might have defended his honor weighed reputations and profit, and many chose the safer path of neutrality. When institutions refuse to adjudicate truth because it threatens the comfort of the powerful, rumor becomes the only available instrument of justice, and rumor is blunt and imprecise. Yet as polite society turned its back, the people who had been closest to Aldridge found their own voices. A servant who had been ignored for years remembered details. A former partner's relative recalled a ledger entry that contradicted the official story. A clerk slipped a copy of a suspicious transaction into the right hands. The slow unmasking that the conspirators had planned now had many hands contributing to it, and the town found it harder to agree on a single convenient fiction. Public humiliation, when organized and persistent, corrodes the pillars of power by revealing the mechanisms that sustain it. Aldridge felt the collapse in small humiliations: dinners without invitations, polite refusals, and the silent cessation of loans. Pride, which had once been his sustaining architecture, now became the scaffold from which he hung. As mysterious deaths continued to haunt the edges of Willowbrook, uncertainty accumulated like sediment in the town's memory. Servants refused dangerous assignments, and a few slipped away under cover of darkness, seeking safety beyond the plantation's fields. Doctors offered varying explanations, each more plausible than the last, and the coroner's notes read like the careful work of men who were not inclined to provoke scandal. Yet patterns emerged despite denial's timing sequence, and the odd coincidences that cluster around a single household. Philip and Henry watched as panic softened the social defenses that had protected Aldridge. His decisions grew reckless and poorly concealed. Each betrayal he discovered among friends further eroded his ability to command trust. The conspirators did not celebrate death. They acknowledged its strategic utility when institutions failed to act. As the town's gossip turned to questions and the bank notices moved from private to public, the planter found himself hemmed in by both legal pressure and social contempt. Those who had supported him in the name of convenience now found their own names implicated by proximity. The fear Aldridge had cultivated now turned and bit at his heels, and he began to suspect even those who had been loyal for years. That suspicion is itself corrosive. It makes men clench and strike, and it opens the door to errors that might have been avoided in calmer times. The pressure mounted until even his own actions served as admission, and the tide of evidence that had once been so carefully manipulated by the conspirators now rolled forward with a momentum all its own. In a last bid to command the narrative, Aldridge turned to spectacle again, but this time his theatrics reeked of desperation. He staged punishments, levied fines, and pronounced penalties meant to cow those around him into continued obedience. He hoped to present his brutality as necessary discipline and to recast himself as a man besieged by bad fortune. But terror is not a sustainable form of loyalty. It breeds cunning, gossip, and eventually collusion against the terror's source. Men who once admired the planter now flinched and made plans of their own. The very punishments he ordered began to appear petty to those who had endured worse, and the community's patience thinned. As his cruelty escalated, so did the determination of those who would no longer tolerate his rule. Small acts of passive resistance multiplied: a missed report here, an unnoticed ration there, a quiet refusal that rippled through the house and fields. Aldridge's punishments lost their meaning because the social frame that gave them power was dissolving. When authority is rooted in mutual consent, however coerced, it collapses when consent evaporates. The men who had plotted his ruin did not need to storm the house with torches. They needed the slow, quiet withdrawal of support. Pride and fear, once useful instruments, became his undoing. In the increasingly hollowed-out world of his own making, Aldridge found only companions who guarded their own safety first. He grew smaller, angrier, and more erratic, which only confirmed to the town that his house was not a seat of strength, but a place where power had curdled into paranoia. With Aldridge weakened and his social backstop eroded, Philip and Henry tightened the legal knots that would complete the public unmaking. They brought disputes over deeds to light, re-examined mortgage terms, and leveraged the newly fragile public opinion to press judges and clerks in ways they had not done before. The terms they set were not merely financial. They were designed to strip him of the pageantry that had protected his dignity. In rooms where faces were polite and tones measured, Aldridge was presented with choices that read like an auction of honor: relinquish certain lands, sign documents affirming particular facts, accept penalties, and publicly acknowledge arrangements that would make his neighbors recoil. The settlement pushed him into a legal recognition that turned the mock marriage into a formal instrument of humiliation. The certificate that had been used as a weapon now became a legal chain. He signed, as many men sign under pressure, hoping that ink could close doors that strategy had opened. But signatures cannot erase conscience or the slow accumulation of evidence. He handed over parcels of land that once defined his standing and consented to public records that would be read as proof of his moral failure. The spectacle the conspirators had planned was no longer just rumor. It was a documentable reality that a court could read aloud. In that moment, Aldridge learned the cost of being outplayed on the field he had once thought his own law, when used against the proud, can be as humbling as scandal and as definitive as exile. The marriage forced an interior rearrangement in Celeste's life that neither she nor anyone around her could simplify into triumph or pure tragedy. She learned how to wear the public role assigned to her, and within that role, she carved out small sovereignties that mattered in the daily calculus of living. Her intelligence and steadiness allowed her to negotiate reprieves, food for a child here, a delay in a punishment there, a favor that kept someone from being sold away. Those small acts accumulated into protections for families who depended on her interventions. She began to act like a steward of broken things, keeping pieces together so that life might go on. The respect with which some neighbors, women who understood her worth, began to address her changed what the community would tolerate. Celeste kept a private ledger of names in her mind, cataloging who had been kind and who had been cruel, who might be helpful in the future, and who should be avoided. She did not see herself as heroic, she saw herself as practical, making choices that improved immediate prospects for survival. In quiet hours, she imagined more a life beyond Willowbrook, a small house upriver, a field of her own. Those imaginations were not idle. They informed the decisions she made in moments when favors could be bartered and when signatures could be negotiated. The conspirators had believed they could use her as a prop. Instead, she became a subtle agent whose small acts of mercy changed outcomes for many. Her choices were not always pure or fully emancipatory, but they were real and consequential. In the end, survival in such a place is a series of compromises that accumulate into a kind of strategy, and Celeste's strategy was as fierce as it was quiet. The final unmasking took place not in a single roaring confrontation, but through a cascade of small truths laid carefully into public view. Letters, ledgers, and bankers' notices were allowed to circulate among the right people. Conversations in gentlemen's clubs that once protected Aldridge now turned toward the specifics that contradicted his story. Evidence that had been patiently collected, accounts of payments, records of strange transfers, eyewitness reports that could not be bought, began to cohere. Men who had earlier covered their ears found that silence no longer served them. The paper trail demanded attention. Aldridge's denials slapped against the wall of corroboration, and without the chorus of public defenders, his narrative splintered. The plantation itself, which had served as a fortress of performance, became the scene where neighbors read aloud the terms of his humiliation. With every confirmation, his options narrowed. Allies who once offered polite support now excused themselves, and those who had been neutral in the face of rumor began to speak with blunt clarity. The law, once pliable to his benefit, found procedural footholds in the mountains of documents that proved misdeeds. What the conspirators had orchestrated with patience now looked like the slow but undeniable march of justice, and the town's consensus hardened into a verdict that social ritual and legal paper could no longer erase. In the months that followed the unmasking, Aldridge's life became a sequence of small exiles. He handed over lands and watched as leaseholders were reassigned. Hands that had once courted him now treated him as a man whose name was a cautionary example. His health unraveled under the double weight of sleeplessness and shame. He ate poorly, drank too much, and spent hours alone in rooms where portraits of borrowed ancestors watched like witnesses. Neighbors spoke openly now, telling the story of his betrayals over fences and in the churchyard where gossip is a moral currency. His name traveled beyond parish lines as a warning of what hubris and cruelty can do to a man who believes he can buy innocence. He retreated to an upstairs room with a bottle and pages of legal documents that proved what he had lost. At night he asked himself, in the quiet torment of a conscience that had long been dulled, whether the man he had become was worth the fortune he had taken. Some nights he rose and paced as if searching for a lost map. Some nights he simply sat and allowed the memory of things to weigh him down. Even those who had once admired him felt a complicated sorrow because the story did not exist in simple moral binaries. Instead, it revealed how systems of power can make monsters by rewarding certain appetites, and how revenge, even when it serves a historical wrong, leaves traces of its own cost. Celeste's choices after the collapse were not cinematic flights to immediate freedom. They were careful, legal negotiations and quiet arrangements that used the very instruments designed to oppress into tools for her emancipation. She learned how to work the new legalities to secure small but crucial rights for herself and for families she cared for. One morning, under terms that would have been unthinkable months earlier, she signed a paper allowing her to leave Willowbrook with a modest chest and the legal ability to sell or trade a small parcel of land. Freedoms bought at a high moral cost, but nonetheless real. She did not depart with trumpets or proclamations. She left quietly, walking down the lane with a few trusted people and a small sum of money she had been able to secure. Some said she moved upriver to a town where anonymity promised safety. Others whispered that she invested in relatives and helped purchase a plot where a family might plant and claim something like permanence. Her leaving was not a vanishing act, but a transformation, a reallocation of agency into a life she could shape, imperfectly and painstakingly. Those who remained at Willowbrook felt her absence as a kind of wound, because she had been the hinge that kept many daily mercies possible. Her departure left a mark, a reminder that within systems of cruelty there are always people who find ways to protect, to negotiate, and to build futures that resist being written by the powerful. The story of Willowbrook is larger than a single scandal. It reveals how institutions collaborate to preserve narratives that make violence tolerable. Lawyers who crafted plausible defenses, bankers who preferred stability to scrutiny, and clergy who counseled quiet reconciliation all played roles in sustaining what should have been unacceptable. The rituals of domesticity and the language of respectability created a convenient fog behind which exploitation could operate. When brittle papers surface and diaries are read aloud in attics, the neat stories many prefer to tell about a genteel past crumble, and the architecture of cruelty becomes visible. That architecture is made from daily choices: the clerk who looks away, the judge who avoids investigation, the neighbor who refuses to speak. Each played a part in a system that allowed men like Aldridge to thrive for as long as they did. And yet this is not merely a tale of institutional failure. It is also a story of human cunning and survival. Philip and Henry turned grief into strategy, and Celeste turned suffering into practical measures that protected lives in the moment. The moral landscape here is complicated. Revenge can sometimes deliver a form of corrective justice, but revenge carries costs and ripples into lives beyond its target. What remains essential is the lesson that secrecy is the ally of oppression, and that exposure, slow, patient, and precise, can unravel dangerous illusions. We keep these stories not to celebrate retribution, but to understand how systems work and to learn where interventions might prevent future harms. If, as you listened, your sense of certainty about the past shifted, that is the purpose of this kind of story, to disturb the polite narratives that let cruelty persist. We remember Celeste not simply as a victim, but as someone who carved dignity in a place designed to deny it. We remember the men who sought justice for murdered relatives, and the cost that justice demanded of their souls and of others around them. This tale is a mirror. It asks us to look at the structures that make atrocities bureaucratic and quotidian, and it asks what price is paid when a society values decorum over honest inquiry. Archives do not judge, they record. The brittle signature, the filed affidavit, the ledgers and letters, they all remain for those willing to look. And if you find yourself unsettled, consider that unsettledness a necessary discomfort, because it is how attention turns into action. When communities keep secrets to protect the comfortable, they make room for harm to continue. The remedy begins with curiosity, then moves to scrutiny, and finally to collective insistence that institutions answer for the past. This story ends not with a tidy moral, but with an invitation: look closely at the papers, listen to the whispers saved in attics, and refuse the convenient silence that preserves power. The archive will remain brittle, but readers willing to peer into its pages can learn how to prevent such cruelties from being repeated.